Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's time to continue text past the developers for July of 2023, and this time we're having a look at the naval forces. For me, I actually really enjoy looking at the naval forces because it's one of those parts of history which I'm not as, learned in as ground and aviation. So to learn about some weird and wonderful new vehicles, especially since there's so many different variants of different vehicles around the place, it's always lovely to see. So let's get into some of the interesting ships and boats sat around the place. The first vehicle is the USS Timmerman from America. This was the final ship of the 152 planned Gearing-class destroyers, of which the United States Navy would actually only build 98. The Gearing-class was, for most part, laid down during the Second World War. However, most of these ships would arrive too late to see any wartime service. Instead, the ships would mostly spend the late 40s on training cruises. However, they would see extensive use during the Cold War. As part of this post-war service, and owing to their more modern hull designs, the Gearing-class ships were often chosen for various upgrade programs over their Second World War counterparts, such as the Fletcher and Allen N. Sumner-class destroyers. Gearing-class ships would continue to serve up until the 1980s with the US Navy and into the 2000s with several foreign navies, with the last ARM Netzulalcoatl D-102 being retired by Mexico in 2014. Despite this, 5 ships of the class are currently preserved as museums and memorials around the world. The ship that would become the USS Timmerman was laid down on the 1st of October 1945 by Bath Iron Works Shipyard and was named after Sergeant Grant Timmerman, a U.S. Marine Corps Medal of Honor recipient. However, due to the cessation of hostilities, all work on the ship was ordered suspended by the U.S. Navy on the 7th of January 1946, when she was only 45% complete. The shipyard, however, was ordered not to scrap the incomplete hull, as there may still be a need or use for the unfinished hull. This ultimately proved true, as the US Navy on the 24th of March 1946 officially ordered the construction to resume, albeit to a modified design as an experimental destroyer. As part of this redesign, the shipyard and its designers were given complete oversight of the project. The designers were to build this destroyer how they saw fit, but as a caveat, they were also ordered to incorporate as many new ideas as possible. As part of the redesign process, it was decided to use parts that had been intended to be used on 2 prior experimental destroyers that had never actually been built. These included turbine parts from the USS Percival, as well as other parts intended for the USS Watson. During construction, it was also decided to change the material of the superstructure of the ship from steel to aluminium, and also redesign the bow for better seakeeping and also speed. Further changes were also made to the ship's armament, including the deletion of the remaining torpedo tubes and the addition of further AA guns. Construction of the future USS Timmerman would occur from 1946 to 51, when the ship was finally launched after the US Navy stepped in and requested Bath Iron Works to speed up the work in order to begin testing the ship immediately. The Timmerman would finally be commissioned a year later on the 26th of September 1952. She would spend the next 4 years serving the role of an experimental test destroyer and would even achieve speeds of up to 43 knots in sea trials. Officially, the ship was rated for 41.5 knots. The results of the testing were nothing short of success. The engineering and propulsion systems were viewed favorably, to the point that a similar system was used on the Mitcher-class destroyers, and the aluminium superstructure would become a staple for future US Navy warships, despite some concerns that were levied about its survivability. In 1954, however, due to various budget cuts, as well as the US Navy's priorities shifting to more modern designs, USS Timmerman was redesignated AG-152 to show that the US Navy did not consider it a combat-capable ship. In 1956, the ship was decommissioned and used as a test hulk before being sold for scrap in 1959, thus ending the life of one of the most unique destroyers the US Navy ever operated. The next ship is the Type 051 class guided missile destroyer. Basically this, the Type 051, was also known as the Luda class, which was referred to by NATO, is a class of 17 guided missile destroyers built over the duration of most of the Cold War from 1968 to 91 for the PLAN. Work on the class began in the 1960s, with the class itself being based off the Soviet Project 41 destroyer, but incorporated elements of the Project 56 class destroyers. However, with the Sino-Soviet split, work ceased before restarting in 1965, which saw the class diverge further from the Soviet counterparts, with the ships still retaining elements which made them resemble the Soviet counterparts. But the ships themselves were radically different from the Project 41 and also 56 designs. The class itself used a completely different superstructure compared to the Soviet ships, with the Type 051 having a larger bridge, and as both classes evolved through the Cold War, they began to take different paths of evolution, with Soviet ships of the Project 56 class from the very start. Though the class did retain the twin 130mm guns and turrets, the entire armament otherwise was completely different, with the ships completing with 6 anti-ship missile launchers, which used the Haiying-1 SSM in 2 triple mounts. These were located amidship, with the launchers being placed where the torpedo tubes were located on the Soviet designs. The ship also had an AA armament, which consisted of 4 twin 57mm AA guns and 2 twin 25mm AA guns. Additionally, the ship had 2 ASWRLs with 12 rockets on each mount, and they also had 4 depth charge throwers and 2 depth charge racks, and were capable of carrying 38 mines, though with the ships completing over such a large period of time, later ships would complete with different armaments and systems, and along with modernizations and conversions, the class would have 9 versions of the class, consisting of many different variants. The class itself, for a design which started in the 1960s, one entered as early as 1971, would find itself in service for a substantial amount of time, as the class would only see decommissioning in the late 2000s, and most of the class would end up leaving service in the 2010s, with the last vessel leaving service in 2020. Due to their more recent decommissioning, most of the class has been preserved as museum ships, with 12 ships total being preserved out of the 17, with only 1 vessel being lost as a result of an internal explosion. We also have the H-class battleship, the H-39. The H-class of battleship is not actually a singular class of battleship, but a series of planned battleships for the Kriegsmarine before the Second World War. These ships were quite literally larger Bismarcks, with the ship being focused on, with the one that we're looking at here, the H-39, having 16-inch guns. However, her primary and secondary layouts was the same as the Bismarck class. As for the story behind the H-class, they were part of Plan Z, which was the plan to bolster the Kriegsmarine surface fleet. The plan itself was the successor plan from the previous Plan X, which was more of a draft followed by Plan Y, with Plan Z succeeding Plan Y. Plan Z called for the following: 90 torpedo boats, 68 destroyers, 22 scout cruisers, 13 light cruisers, 5 heavy cruisers, just the 5 Admiral Hipper-class ships, 15 Panzerschiff, ships similar to the Deutschland class, 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battle cruisers, and not the Scharnhorst class, but this was the O class, and then 10 battleships. As the focus is on the H-39 for the H-class, Plan Z called for the 2 Scharnhorst classes, both Bismarck-class ships, and then the other 6 would consist of ships of the H-class, which were, as mentioned previously, not a singular class of ship, and if they would make even the French look normal when it came to tweaking their designs for each ship of the class. The H-39 design was basically a larger version of the Bismarck with 16-inch guns, like other H-class ships would be designed, and in terms of armament, the H-39 design was very similar to their predecessors, with the exception of the main battery. The secondary battery would be exactly identical, with 12 150mm guns in twin turrets, with 3 per side on the ship, with 2 turrets located near the bridge superstructure, 2 located near the first funnel, and the last 2 more closer to the second. The AA battery would contain 16 105mm guns in the same twin mounts as found on the Bismarck, and in terms of AA guns, the ship was planned to use 16 37mm and 24 20mm AA guns. To round off the weapons, the H-39 would have, unlike Bismarck or Tirpitz, 6 underwater torpedo tubes in the bow, even though every major naval power had seen the common sense to eliminate them from their own battleships, with the exception of the British, who did remove them from many of their dreadnought battleships, but the designers decided to give their Nelson class the underwater torpedo tubes because why not? The ships would retain the 3 propeller arrangement, which was in fact a design flaw, as seen as what happened on the Bismarck. The ship would be powered by 12 MAN 9-cylinder diesel engines, with 4 per propeller shaft, giving them 165,000 SHP, giving them a design speed of 30 knots. The ship also had 3 rudders in total, with 1 main rudder aligned with the keel and center propeller shaft and 2 smaller wing rudders. Armor would be similar to the Bismarck, with 300mm for the main belt and 145mm for the upper, 220mm for the bulkheads, 385 to 150mm of armor for the main turrets, which is slightly greater than the Bismarck classes, 365mm for the barbettes, 350 to 200 for the conning tower, 50 to 80 for the upper decks, and 100 to 120 for the main armor deck, as well as 45mm for the torpedo bulkheads. Similar to the issue the French had, where they had a limited amount of shipyards that were capable of building such ships, in the Germans' case they only had 4 capable to build them. 2 ships would have their keels laid down under the designations Schlagschiff H and Schlagschiff J. Schlagschiff H was laid down in mid-July 1939, while J was just laid down in the beginning of September, which would be the same month that Germany would invade Poland, and as such work was suspended on both ships as it was viewed that the ships would not be completed until the war ended. In the end, neither ship would come close to completion, as resources were prioritized for the Luftwaffe as well as the army. One caveat, however, was that the guns meant for the class would be built, used as coastal guns, with at least 10 guns made, with a total of 7 being deployed in Norway and another 3 used in Poland, before being dismounted and used in France, which appeared to have been later scrapped, but the guns in Norway had a different fate, as only 3 of them would be scrapped, while the other 4 were kept around, of which one of these guns is now open as part of a museum. Despite work on the ships coming to a complete halt in 1941, the design of the H-class would be revised, now known as the H-41, which was not to modify the existing design of the H-39, but as an improved design, so no ships of the modified or subsequent designs, which would follow a trend of being even larger than the last ship, ever be laid down, or have any parts made for them, making the H-39 class the most advanced German battleships that were designed and also began construction. The next vehicle is the Fairmile D-type fast patrol boat HMS P5031. Basically, the 5031 was originally the MTB 758, a Fairmile D motor torpedo boat constructed by Alexander Robertson and Sons Limited Yacht Builders in October 1944 for the Royal Navy. As one of the later constructed NTBs, she didn't see much significant service in the Second World War. Even so, she was one of the few Fairmile Ds that managed to survive post-war economic woes. She was also one of the few Fairmile Ds to have retained that were not new builds from 1945. After the war, the 4.5-inch 8 CWT Mark I cannon had finished development and became the standard armament for Royal Navy MGBs, replacing the 6-pounder Mark IIA that had previously been mounted on the Fairmile D vessels. For simplicity, the MGBs and MTBs of yore were referred to as FPBs, or fast patrol boats, regardless of their configuration. This was because the vessels could be converted from MTB to MGB relatively easily. This modularity allowed the Royal Navy to customize vessels for a particular purpose without needing to build new hulls, and the practice was done frequently in the Second World War. However, there is a rare overlooked type of Fairmile D, the dual-purpose vessel. These vessels combined the facilities and armaments of both the MTB and MGB variants, as can be seen with the MTB 697. P-5031 was unique among her sisters, though, as the dual-purpose role had generally been dropped post-war. However, she retained two 21-inch torpedo tubes along with her impressive cannon armament and was sailing with this configuration through 1953. By 1955, she had been standardized as a gunboat, and the torpedo tubes were removed. 1 year later, she was then sold off. Despite not seeing combat use in her post-war configuration, P-5031 would be an excellent addition because of its general armament, with two of the 4.5-inch 140mm cannons and then the two 20mm basically Oerlikons in a dual mount, and then also its torpedoes. It also had access to a surface radar and also a flare launcher on the forward gun mount. We then have the O-class destroyer, the HMS Onslow, and the reason why I added this is because I'm a big fan of keeping up appearances, and also I've been described as Onslow in the past. So the HMS Onslow, or the G-17, is the destroyer leader of the O-class of British destroyers. Designed before the outbreak of the war to be as a medium-sized destroyer in the middle of the smaller Hunt-class escort destroyers and the larger Tribal-class destroyers. She, like three other O-class destroyers, were built with 4.7-inch cannons, in mind with the other four of the O-class being built with the smaller 4-inch cannons. During the interwar years, the British Navy was primarily equipped with many much older classes of destroyers, such as the V&W and S classes of the early interwar period. The British Empire needed to constantly produce newer destroyers to keep its naval dominance in check, starting with the early 1930s built A and B classes, and slowly working the way through many classes of destroyers for the 1930s, to compete with both the newer hordes of American destroyers being built alongside the threat of the Japanese Navy. During 1938, the Admiralty had developed the idea of a destroyer class designed to be in between the size of a large destroyer and an escort destroyer. These destroyers were intended to replace the outdated old V&W class of destroyers still in service in the Navy, since being in service since 1917. The class was to be fitted with 120mm mounts, multi-barreled pom-poms, two quadruple 12.7mm MGs, and two quadruple TTs, making the ships almost identical in armaments to the H-class based on the specific designs. The role of the Onslow and the other O-class destroyers was to be larger escorts that could be more versatile in fighting other destroyers, whilst also being able to combat submarines. All 8 O-class destroyers were launched in 1940 and would be built between 1941 and 42, and would serve as the first emergency flotilla, whilst the second emergency flotilla would be that of the P-class of similar ships. Unlike the P-class, though, 8 O-classes were split into 4 ships, which had been armed with 120mm mounts, whilst the other 4 would be armed with 102mm mounts. All O-class ships would survive the war. The HMS Onslow was commissioned on the 23rd of September 1941, with her construction being completed on the 8th of October. She would immediately sent to the Home Fleet and later becoming destroyer leader during the Arctic convoy missions of 1941, being sent there and being attacked by a German bomber on the 28th of November 1941 during the flotilla's passing of Kola Inlet. Later, in December the same year, she would take part in Operation Archery, attacking coastal convoys and capturing an Enigma cipher machine. In 1942, Onslow would continue to escort in the Arctic, which also involved the unsuccessful attempt to search for the German battleship the Tirpitz. She would later find herself in the service of the Mediterranean Sea to take part in Operation Harpoon, which she would escort until she reached the Strait of Sicily, in which she returned back to the Home Fleet in order to escort in the Arctic once again. She would yet again escort another convoy to Malta in Operation Pedestal in August. During September, she would escort in the Arctic and come across a heavy German attack of both submarines and aircraft, and would later find and sink U-589. In November, she would help in Operation Torch, escorting convoys, whilst in December, she would fight a German task force led by the Admiral Hipper in the Battle of the Barents Sea. She would also take 3 hits from the Hipper and be set on fire. However, she managed to fend off and keep the Hipper away from getting closer with dummy torpedoes, allowing time for the HMS Sheffield and Jamaica to arrive and turn the tide of the battle. For the last few years of the war, she would continue to escort in the Arctic with a couple detours such as Operation Neptune on D-Day to aid the Allies into securing northern France. After the war, she would continue to be in the Home Fleet and later the Reserve Fleet until the 30th of September 1949, and was sold to Pakistan. Being commissioned under a new name, Tipu Sultan, she would serve as a fleet destroyer until 1957, where she was converted into an anti-submarine frigate and remained in the Pakistani fleet until 1960. She would remain on the active list until 1980, where she was scrapped, making her the last of the O-class destroyers to be scrapped. And then we have the Project 30BA destroyer, the Dumyat. In the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet government was a strong ally of Egypt's Nasser government and supported it during the Suez Crisis and Six-Day War against Israel. This support included supplying the nation with warships from fast attack craft to destroyers, which Egypt would put to good use, scoring the first ever anti-ship missile kill with a Soviet missile boat shortly after the Six-Day War. In 1967, the Egyptian Navy purchased 2 old destroyers from the Soviet Union, which would be modernized before delivery. The 2 ships would be called Dumyat and El Nasser, formerly the Project 30 BIS destroyers Besmeni and also Oktyabni, respectively of the Black Sea Fleet. Besmeni was laid down in 1951 at the 61 Communards shipyard in Nikolaev and was commissioned in 1952. The ship had an uneventful service, with its most notable events being a visit to Yugoslavia and Albania. At the end of 1956, it was decommissioned and mothballed, but was recommissioned 3 years later. In 1967, the ship underwent a modernization project, or modernization to Project 30BA, in preparation for its transfer to Egypt. The secondary 85mm turret was removed and replaced with a quad 57mm autocannon. Some other AA guns were removed to make space for a modern tracking radar, ASW rocket launchers were fitted, and its radar replaced with new ones. It was delivered to Egypt in 1968, shortly after the Six-Day War, and commissioned into the fleet as Dumyat, or Damietta. In 1969, it and El Nasser bombarded Israeli forces on the Sinai coast, inflicting some losses. They were attacked by Israeli aircraft as they returned to Alexandria, with the Egyptians claiming the destruction of 2 planes. The plane would serve until 1985, when it was disarmed and then scrapped. So those are the suggestions passed to developers for Naval, well at least TECs passed to developers. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Brendan Quinn, Vilneus, Character Fuel, Juan the Panda, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, Bareen, Peter Grayling, Alan Hacker, Sem Alslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R., and also Lafouche for supporting the channel.